Great. So we are live now. The room is populating slowly. So I'll wait a minute or two. And then we'll get started. So I'm going to give people another minute or so. It's nice to see it fill up. I did an academic talk a few weeks ago. It didn't populate like this. There were like 6 of us. So it was less fun. Okay, so might as well get started. Let's not waste time. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a really exciting panel for you today. My name is Dominic Setsua. I am an assistant professor in political science at Colorado State University. So I got mine, but a lot of people had to leave academia. The market is pretty rough out there. I'm kind of still scarred by by the 3 cycles in the market. So I always thought that it would be good, given a platform, to have events like this to allow grad students and really anybody else interested to get information about what it is like doing kind of meaningful research related work outside of academia. So this is what today is for. We have a fantastic panel, 5 amazing people who graciously volunteered their time. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce everybody. Then we're going to take a few minutes. We're going to give about 10 minutes or so to each panelist. We'll go in order from the program to just tell us more about themselves, what their work is like, their background, anything they want to share. And then we'll spend the rest of the time on conversation about what it is like doing work outside of academia, and any of the other kind of questions that people have posed in their RSVPs. If anything comes to mind as you're listening to our panelists, please pop your question into the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that, and I hope we have a productive and useful discussion. And again, this isn't just for graduate students. I know there's some people who RSVP'd who are potentially thinking of jumping ship. So this is really for anybody who just wants to know what the options are, what does this work look like, and how does one really tap into it as an academic. So the panelists today are fantastic. Everybody's a PhD, so I won't say doctor to everybody. You're just all doctors, so I just want to acknowledge that. We have Nicole Bonoff, who's a staff researcher on civic integrity at Twitter. We have Yana Gorgovskaya, who leads research on transnational repression at Freedom House. We have Peter Licari, who is a director of data science at Morning Consult. We have Mike Miller, who directs the Just Tech program and the Media and Democracy program, both at the Social Science Research Council. And finally, we have Neil Stenhouse, who is the research director at Empower Project. So we have social media, we have polling companies, we have NGOs. So we have really a wide scope of places where this kind of work is done. So I'm super excited. I'll shut up now, and I'm going to hand it over to Nicole.
Hi, very happy to be here. Just a quick bit of background on myself. So I did my PhD at UC San Diego. And while I was at UC San Diego, I focused on politics of development in sub-Saharan Africa. So really nothing to do with social media. And I kind of found myself in tech, I think by accident. So when I was in graduate school, I never was academia or bust. I felt like government service was always an option for me, especially working in this field of development. And so I even explicitly explored that and took a fellowship at the US Agency for International Development, helping run a research group that did randomized controlled trial experiments in democracy and human rights and governance. And then I had an opportunity to go ahead and try academia and took a postdoc, and I hated it. And I realized very quickly, I was like, what am I doing here? Like, this isn't for me. This isn't what I want to do. I don't really like the pace of research in academia. I like to work more collaboratively with people who are, have different perspectives and different skills than me. And so I started looking for non-academic jobs, and I applied for the places that I thought someone with a political science PhD should apply to. Um, and I had job offers from the State Department. I had a job offer from RAND, from the RAND Corporation. And then I was headhunted on Facebook or on LinkedIn from Facebook. And this was in 2017. And I was like, what does Facebook want with a political scientist? And that's maybe a sign I'm not a very good political scientist if I like didn't have an answer to that. And I was being recruited for the team that worked on like new to internet people and internet and electricity infrastructure in developing countries. So this idea like, okay, many places of the world, people's first experience on the internet is going to be on Facebook. And I remember asking the hiring manager, and I've told this story before, well, what if the biggest barrier to internet and Facebook adoption in developing countries is the like lack of a ability to charge your cell phone? Is Facebook going to hand out hand crank generators to the entire global south? And the hiring manager said, yes, if that's what it takes. And I was really like taken aback by this, thinking about, wow, like what would it be like to work on sort of kind of development issues where that wasn't necessarily the goal, but it had this sort of like positive externality. Like, because if you could charge your cell phone, you could go and trade at the marketplace, you could get critical information, all these other things. And yeah, you might be on Facebook. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to just take this leap and not like worry about it and not overly think about it. And I got there in August of 2017. And about like 3 weeks after I started, I got pulled into a room and was like, we're starting a civic integrity team, and you're about one of the few people here who has a political science PhD. Do you want to switch teams and join the new civic integrity team at Facebook? And I was like, okay, like here we go. And so that's how I ended up on the civic integrity team at Facebook. And that sort of gotten me to where my career is today. So I spent 2 years on the civic integrity team at Facebook, and then a year and a half on the privacy team at Facebook, and now have been at Twitter on the civic integrity team for almost a year and a half. I will wrap up by kind of giving like a few pieces of sort of advice and like observations that I think are really important that I had no idea of before I entered tech. I think that there's an assumption, very strong assumption within academia, that to have access to tech jobs, you need to be a hardcore computational social scientist. And I'm here to tell you that is not the case. I am not a computational social scientist in any way. Yes, I can run experiments, but I am not some sort of data guru. In fact, most of the research positions that exist within tech are for people who are purely qualitative. And what is far more important is your ability to communicate research results to a diverse audience that doesn't necessarily understand results and doesn't understand research. And what you're supposed to be doing for them is saying, here are the results and here are the implications of this for your work. So it's this very uncomfortable space, I think, for a lot of academics where if you've ever been to any job talk, the final slide is, and because of this, we need to do more research. That's like not a sufficient answer within industry. Within industry, you have to say, because of this, we need to do this thing, and leaving people with marching orders for, you're a designer, you do this, you're an engineer, you do this, if we believe these results. So I think those are kind of like the two things that I would, I'll just start with leaving is like, there's very much room for people who do qualitative work. And what in fact people are looking for is comfort in articulating research to a diverse audience and discussing the implications of that research. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And my mind is already blown because I think so many misperceptions exist in terms of that exact point. We'll talk more about this later, but let's move on to Jana.
Hey, Dom, thanks for inviting me. Really happy to be on this panel, and I wish that this panel had happened when I was finishing my PhD. Um, so my name is Yana Gorohovska. Dom and I got our PhDs from the same place, University of British Columbia. Yeah. I received my PhD in 2016. And then I took a postdoc at Columbia University here in New York, and I spent 3 years as a postdoc there. Like Nicole, I was not academia or bust in my approach to academic work. I sort of fell into the postdoc at Columbia. It was kind of a situation where I was at the right place at the right time and knew the right people, which I think maybe tells you something about the academic job market. But I had already started looking for other work. I was looking at work as a social scientist for the Canadian government when I was finishing my PhD, and then had this opportunity at Columbia. And I really wanted to live in New York, so I took that up. So I spent 3 years there, and I have been at Freedom House for about the last year, a little over a year. Freedom House is, I think, depending on how nerdy the political science audience for this talk is, Freedom House may be familiar to some of you as the publisher and the maker of the Freedom in the World, Freedom on the Net, Nations in Transit indexes, which people love to hate, but always use anyway, because there's not a lot of things that are better than that. So I've been at Freedom House since March of 2021. My title is Senior Research Analyst, and I lead the organization's work on transnational repression, which is a kind of complicated way of saying actions by governments to reach across borders to silence dissent in order to preserve their hold on power. Before Freedom House, I spent a year working at a small think tank in New York that focused on Russian politics, and that intersected with what I did my PhD in, which was in sort of Russian politics, authoritarianism, and civil society and mobilization. And before that think tank, I also worked at a Russian NGO, helping them do survey research and interviews. And I was connected to do that work through my supervisor at the University of British Columbia, who knew the people at that NGO because she worked on civil society, basically. So it took me about, I would say, a year and a half, maybe a year to find a permanent full-time job outside of academia. But I had started preparing for the transition out of academia probably in the last year or so, maybe 6 months of my postdoc. And so I'll just, Dom was kind enough to share some of the questions. So I'll just talk a little bit about kind of the way I prepared for that, or didn't prepare for that, as was the case actually. So I did all the stuff you're supposed to do. Went on informational interviews. I tried to leverage my academic connections into non-academic connections. I met a lot of really, really interesting people on these informational interviews, including people who had made the transition from academia to a non-academic work. The problem I think with that was that a lot of the people who I met who had worked on Russia and had made the transition out of academia had done so sort of in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And it was a really different time then to make that transition. There were a lot of opportunities to basically go from an academic postdoc straight into like being the head of a small bank in Eastern Europe. And times have changed, and no one trusts political scientists with banks anymore, and probably rightfully so. So those were not that helpful. I did meet Ben Stiller at an informational interview, not because I was having the informational interview with him, but because he happened to be at a very expensive private school in New York, where I was meeting someone. So those were not that helpful, although they were really interesting. I would say that the most helpful thing was getting my name out there as an expert in non-academic publications. So I wrote a lot of op-eds. I took opportunities to write for non-academic audiences. I wrote for the Washington Post, for the Guardian, HuffPo, some other outlets. I took opportunities to write for broader audiences, even when those opportunities were inconvenient to me. If I had to do a couple of hours more work on a day to fit in writing for a non-academic audience, I did that. And I think ultimately that paid off, because one of the ways that I got connected to Freedom House before I got my current job was actually I was invited to be an expert evaluating their rankings for freedom in the world at one point. And the person who invited me to do that had read things I had written about Russia and the former Soviet Union previously. So I think that people who are thinking about transitioning out of academia should try and establish a name for themselves, or try and demonstrate some level of expertise or some level of, your ability to analyze things, your ability to comment on things that are happening in the world, to Nicole's point, to explain things in digestible ways for broad audiences. I think that is a really valuable skill. I will say, just in terms of, how I use research in my everyday life, I probably on a day-to-day basis do more research now than I did as an academic. I did way more reading as an academic. I had the luxury of doing way more reading, which is great. And I don't have that luxury anymore. But I do a lot of both kind of conceptual methodological thinking, but also day-to-day research. So some of the ways that I do research are, we have a large N database that we maintain of incidents of transnational repression. We do some correlational analysis. We also share that database with researchers. There's like 4 or 5 PhDs in progress right now that use our data. There's a lot of deciding about which incidents fit our categories, which don't, what that means for kind of how we're tracking this phenomenon. As a lot of social scientists will tell you, the thing that isn't being measured doesn't exist. And so one of the challenges is to, apply a label and actually measure the thing before you get to talk to people about the thing. We also do a lot of interviews. We do interviews with people who've experienced human rights violations. We do interviews with policymakers. We do interviews with tech companies. And we do a lot of policy analysis, right? So how are countries addressing human rights violations? What could they do better? What are the gaps? And again, going back to Nicole's point, I think one of the challenging things that, at NGOs also is that people want solutions, right? So actually it isn't satisfying to just say human rights are being violated and that's bad. So no one, people are already on board with that message. So you need to say, like, human rights are being violated, that's bad. Here's what governments should do. Here's what tech companies should do. Here's what civil society should do. And I don't mean, we don't have the precise answers, but I think being able to put a solution forward is really, really important. And I think that I am much more pushed to do that now than I had ever been as an academic. Someone I thought had a question about staying connected to academia. I think there's a worry for people, if they leave academia, how will they participate in the life of the mind outside of academia? And I'm here to tell you that you can do it in plenty of ways. I have an article under peer review at a journal right now that was written with a group of academics. We participate in a lot of workshops with academics. I think there's a lot of intersection with academia. And I think the other way that I stay connected to academia is that I hated writing back then. I hate writing now. I do a lot more of it now. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yana. Peter.
Yeah, hi. Just to echo what everyone says, very, very grateful to be here. Very excited to have this conversation, and definitely do wish that this was going on, or at the very least I was familiar with this sort of stuff while I was wrapping up my PhD. So I finished up my PhD in fall of 2020. So I got my PhD at the University of Florida. And my dissertation was looking at the ways that video games could influence political attitudes and political participation. My dissertation is kind of like, I guess, emblematic of my general approach to my time in grad school, because although I can't say that I was also I was also not specifically like academia or bust, but I was definitely very strong. Like, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to be this. And I'm going to mangle the quote and something to the effect, I think it's attributed to Jefferson, but Mark Twain and Lincoln, right, who actually knows if he actually said it, but something to the effect of, I find that, I owe a lot of what I do to luck, but I find that the harder I work, the more luck I have. So I kind of treated like academia as a raffle, right? But that the harder I worked, the more tickets I got to buy. And I started so I started doing a lot of work to try to buy more and more tickets. I tried to, work on a dissertation that I thought was novel and interesting, using both quantitative and qualitative methods. I tried to teach. I tried to lean into co-authoring. I tried to do 1.5 million things, and one, I could kind of comfortably point to and say, well, then 2020 happened, right? So that was going to be a thing. But even if 2020 hadn't, kinds of cracks in the edifice of the dream were appearing a lot earlier, if I had to be entirely honest with myself. So like, I remember very vividly of like Christmas Eve of 2018 is what it was. Yeah. And I got a rejection for like one of my first articles on Christmas Eve. I don't know who sends out rejections on Christmas Eve, but someone did. And this rejection included my favorite phrase in a rejection so far. This author does not know the data that he's analyzing, nor the methods by which he analyzes it. So great. Fantastic. I love it. You love to see that as a graduate student. And I'm sitting here like, I looked at my then fiance, now wife, and I said, do I want to do this for the rest of my life? Do I want to make my professional career contingent upon this? And at the time, I guess I thought to myself, I'm a pretty decent writer. I can do this. And then just the stress of it all started happening. So I came into grad school relatively healthy. I did cross country and track in the NCAA for a year in undergrad. I was in really, really good shape, and that started deteriorating. I came out of comps with TMJ. I started dealing with a lot of very strong mental health issues, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. Had to go on medication for anxiety for a bit. My body was breaking down in a variety of ways that my doctors and my family were like, this isn't okay. Something has to change. And so I kind of came to that realization when one of my doctors is just like, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just stressed. And the core of my stress was that I realized about myself, I learned about myself in graduate school, that I am not the kind of person who I cannot do well when there isn't at least a strong visible correlation between the inputs that I do and the outputs that I get in terms of my professional career. Right. So like the fact that I was doing all of these other things and my status over a 5-year period of time had not only changed, but the markets were already getting worse before COVID, everything, like there was no way I could like really point to and say, hey, yeah, I have this output, I'm doing this thing, either in terms of professional or in terms of a larger impact. So because I knew that I was playing a raffle and I am nothing if not a driven pessimist, I kind of started early on thinking about like, what do I need to do in terms of, if I have to make this pivot, how can I prepare myself? And I like doing quantitative analyses. I did do mixed stuff with my dissertation because I think that there's so much depth and beauty to qualitative work, but I'm not smart enough for qual, to be entirely honest, so I do quant. So I did the qual that I was capable of doing for my dissertation, and I think it was fun and good work. But I wanted to stick into my wheelhouse, the thing that I started thinking about, what can I do? What's the market for quant? I looked a lot at like job postings on Indeed and on LinkedIn and other things like that to kind of get a sense of like, what were the in-demand skills, and then didn't necessarily just do it just once, right? Because if you do it just once, you're going to find a whole bunch of things that like are in demand this year and then are no longer in demand next year or whatever. But like over the course of 2 to 3 years, I kind of had a stable sense of, oh, this SQL thing, this is something that's in demand pretty consistently. Like this language is in demand pretty consistently. It looks like R is definitely in more job postings than Stata, and other things like that. So I kind of started figuring out what were the things that were being asked for and started trying to implement them into my day-to-day work. So for instance, I used, basically I started in SPSS in undergrad, then I learned Stata when I started grad school. And then like I forced myself to use R for some projects and other things like that, because I just saw that was what was in demand in terms of the private sector. And that would be a smarter thing to kind of pivot and do. So I think that would be kind of a general piece of advice is that I have, is to kind of think about like, if you are thinking of making that pivot, or that pivot is a possibility for you, to look at, the kinds of jobs that you may be interested in, and what kinds of things that they're asking for, if for nothing else, just to know the lingo, right? That's one big thing that I learned very, very early on, that I felt completely out of place. I mean, I already felt imposter syndrome in academia. I felt pretty bad when I got to the private sector, because I had no idea what anyone was talking about, until I learned that a lot of the stuff we were talking about the same thing, but with different language, right? So we would be, just the other day, someone would be talking about doing some sort of, to use a kind of a relatively glib example, someone would be talking about like an A/B test, and it's like, well, what do you mean by an A/B test? Oh, you just literally mean an experiment. You just mean an experiment. We're just calling them A/B tests now. And other similar things in terms of like, oh, you just mean like, what do you mean by drivers? Oh, you're just doing regression. Cool, I've done regressions, and other things like that. I also kind of thought about ways to like diversify. So like with kind of tech and quantitative stuff in the private sector, a lot of things that we train very, very hard in poli sci and in social sciences in general to get at inferential stats very, very well, but we really don't talk about predictive stuff. But predictive stuff and clustering and other kinds of dimensionality reduction, which is a very fancy way of saying like, I have 17 bajillion variables that I'm looking at right now. Can I winnow that down to something a little more manageable? So like the ways of being able to, those kinds of questions are very, very important, and you see them in poli sci. But again, like dimension reductionality, that's another buzzword, but half the time, what do we mean by that? Factor analysis. It's a big technique for it. It's not the only one, obviously, but it's a big part of that. So it's learning what the lingo is, what the language is. Unabashedly, Wikipedia was very helpful for that. To when I would see something in a job post and go, what does that mean? Oh, it's just this. So I think that one piece of another piece of advice I would say is, it's very easy if you're actually seriously considering making the transition to feel like I don't know anything just because the language is unfamiliar. But and you probably know a lot more than you think you do, for one, and then for two, you definitely know a lot more than you think you do by dint of the years like learning this stuff, right? Not even just in terms of the substantive expertise, but the kinds of the soft skills, quote unquote, that you've learned. You've learned how to be able to research something super in depth. I know, at least for me, if you've survived comps, you'll be able to read something quickly and retain it quickly. That skill doesn't go away, and that's very, very useful for other things. Being able to condense a whole lot of different streams of research into like a general state of play, super useful. So you're coming out with a lot of very important skills, and very valuable skills. It's a lot of it is just a matter of translating it into and translating it into the language of those people familiar in terms of making the hiring decisions. So in terms of what I do on my day to day, like I said, I do a lot of, I love kind of the quantitative stuff. So that's kind of what I lean into. So as Don mentioned, I'm a director of data science at Morning Consult, and specifically we're broken out into regions. So my region, quote unquote, is a virtual one. We handle all of advocacy and government clients for Morning Consult's commercial operations. So I get to work with a lot of really cool interest groups and things like that, and help field their surveys, design their surveys in line with any kinds of analytical goals. So that sometimes can mean setting up their questionnaires so that we can do things as simple as correlations. Maybe we will do survey experiments. We do a lot of survey experiments, a lot of ad testing, a lot of things like that. Then we'll use kind of packages and stuff like that we've built in-house and we will build in-house. We contribute to those if we have the appetite or the want to contribute to that. And we help deliver the analyses and stuff like that. And I will definitely second what was mentioned earlier, that you definitely have to get comfortable with not just saying, well, this is the results. The next step is do more research, because a lot of the groups that we work with are like, well, this was our entire research budget for the year. So what do we do now? So being able to synthesize this into useful and usable research is very, very critical. I remember there was one time, and I guess I'll stop after this in terms of impact and other things like that, because I think I found that place. Like I said, I could not stand not having a kind of a one-to-one, or even not even one-to-one, just some sort of correlation to like what I do, and having some sort of observable impact, both in terms of my career, and I'm very, very lucky to work at a place that does, you know, have performance cycles and things like that that like do a fairly good job at like recognize when people do well. But in terms of larger impact, we work with a few groups that do like things for LGBTQ youth and for other similar things. And I had one of the members of client services, the people who interact directly with the clients, came up to me and said, you know, that regression that we ran, the client is now using that to structure their entire like ad campaigns. Like basically like they are using this to try to like help make the world a better place for trans youth. And I'm like, wow, holy crap. Because this was a, you know, this little regression I ran where it normally would just die in an appendix somewhere in an article is being used by a real life organization looking to help real life people. And that was just amazing to me. And I think that those kinds of opportunities are abound in the private sector. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Peter. I appreciate you sharing that. I had similar kind of health, anxiety related experiences, especially during my postdocs, you know, and my health kind of fell apart. I used to play soccer like 4 times a week, then it just kind of knees and hips went. So I can definitely relate to that. Mike.
Thank you. My name is Mike Miller. I am a program director for the Social Science Research Council, where I direct 2 separate programs. One's called Just Tech, one is called the Media and Democracy Program. My route to the SSRC was in some ways quite arbitrary. I think I wasn't academia or bust, but I certainly didn't have plans to work outside of the academy. I fully intended to get a tenure track job. That was my goal. That was my desire. I finished my PhD in 2017, 2016. I can't remember. It was like the dissertation was done, but I graduated a year later. So I think I was done around the end of 2016. Oh, no, that's a fact. And I'll tell you why in a moment. Because when I finished, I was on the market. And by the way, so I did my PhD at the CUNY Grad Center. And for those of you unfamiliar with the CUNY system, this is the City University of New York, public school, with the PhD granting institution is called the Graduate Center. And then there are several senior colleges around New York City, City College, Queens College, Brooklyn College, you know, there are dozens that are, you know, from regular undergrad to community college. It's a huge public university system. I think maybe the biggest in the country. And I was teaching all over it. And as a CUNY student, you do from jump, you start teaching, and that's just part of your grad school experience. And so when I finished, I was adjuncting, and you know, to get a little bit more money, I was teaching more classes than I was able to teach during grad school. So when I finished, I was teaching 5 classes on 3 campuses. I had 175 students. And then I had my daughter, my first kid. Which maybe I just didn't have the space to kind of consider what that entailed when I was in grad school. But pretty early on, I was like, holy cow, I don't think this is a sustainable way to live. And I'm not going to stay on the job market for another round if I don't land a job. And in fact, I'm going to start looking for other kinds of jobs right away, because, you know, working as contingent faculty, they can just take, you know, you can just lose your course or all of your courses at one time, and you're in a bad way, which I think without a child, I was fine taking that risk. And then with a child, I was not. So I started immediately looking for other things that I could do. I had like a side hustle as a copy editor. I just, I edited a lot of my friends' papers during grad school. So I was making a little bit of money doing that. And I kind of on a whim, I guess, applied to the ACLS Public Fellows program. For those of you not familiar with it, ACLS, the American Council of Learned Societies, they ran a fellowship called Public Fellows Program. It is now transitioned into slightly different shape and purpose. It's now called the Leading Edge Fellowship. But the goal of that program is to take newly minted PhDs and place them in nonprofit orgs outside of the academy all around the country, and demonstrate that folks with PhDs can do things besides teach and research. And so that was a 2-year stint. And so my role was at the Social Science Research Council. I was a ACLS fellow / program officer, working on a program that I now direct called Media and Democracy. And so that's how I got here. It was like just the reality of needing to pay bills and support children made me realize I didn't have the stomach for a long job, long time on the market. But in my role as a fellow, I was largely responsible for putting together public events and workshops. The Media and Democracy program, I'll step back for very briefly. SSRC, if you're not familiar with the organization, it's a support organization for social scientists. And so the way that we support social scientists is in different ways. Some of our programs produce a bunch of reports. They do their own research. Some of our programs put together events or research development workshops. That's what my program did at Media and Democracy. Others run fellowships. The International Dissertation Research Fellowship, IDRF. You may have seen it in the news recently, because after 25 years, it's shutting down after this cohort. But that's the kind of thing that SSRC does. I run a program also called Just Tech, which is a fellowship. And yeah, so my role, for the first couple of years at SSRC was working on a program where we were thinking about the impact of new forms of media on politics and on social interactions. And that was, for me, it was great because I had done my dissertation. I guess I should have said this at the top. I'm a comparativist. I did my dissertation on new media in China and how new media were shaping the ability of the state to control populations. And when I started my PhD, it was kind of right around the Arab Spring. And I think this was like peak techno liberation period in world history, where people thought Facebook and Twitter were gonna really, save everyone. You just drop it somewhere and states couldn't control it, and candy-coated rainbows. And so my dissertation was really a reaction to that. And it was joined a chorus of people saying, no, actually states have very real and very powerful mechanisms to control their societies, despite the challenges of new media. So landing in the Media and Democracy program, I had an opportunity to support people who are thinking about similar kinds of things. And it was a great time, especially for me. And I'll use this to kind of segue away from the spiel about myself. I think that I probably peaked in my PhD career around the time of my comps. I really am one of these people. I just loved reading. I got a PhD because I just wanted to know everything. I wanted to read all the stuff that everybody else wrote. I liked writing about it. I liked talking about it. When it came to doing my own research, I was, on the fence. I do like writing, but I was less concerned about creating new knowledge in the world, much more concerned about discussing it. So in this role, we think a lot about what we need to know, who knows it, and then go out and write a lit review, and then use that lit review to inform a call for papers, and then read a ton of abstracts about folks who would like to do research on X, and then help choose the people who are going to do research on X, right? And then convene those people, and then talk about it, and then maybe edit an essay series and write about it. And so for me, this has been, it's been fantastic because I get to do a lot of the things that I liked doing in my dissertation. And here's the segue in the kind of call to action. I would encourage everyone on the call, if you're thinking about transitioning outside of the academy, really think about what it was that brought you to the academy in the first place, or if not that, what it was that you really liked doing in your PhD, because those are transferable skills. And I think that something I wish that I had been encouraged to do, and I since have had a few opportunities to do it, is just take a skills audit. Think about all the things that you do. I mean, really, just write them down. Make a list. Write all the things that you do down, and then break those down into smaller subcategories of things that you do, and then go and look at some jobs that are out there. I think probably over the course of this conversation, we'll talk about, different sectors that you might work in, but go look at some jobs, even the ones that you think you're not qualified for, and see the things that they describe, and see if you can backfill with the things that you do. I bet you there's a lot of things that they describe that you actually do, giving presentations, ingesting, synthesizing, summarizing knowledge. You hear funders say things like, we're doing a field scan, or we're in a learning phase right now. I mean, that they're doing lit reviews. They're going out, seeing what everybody knows, right? They've got a team of people who are there to ingest it and then summarize it and then communicate it to non-expert audiences who don't have the time. That's what you do when you're teaching classes. That's what you did when you wrote your comps, right? Those are just the bread and butter skills of being an academic, figuring out what other people know so you're not reinventing the wheel, and then communicating it to other smart people who just haven't read the books or who haven't done that work. Have you gotten an award before? That's writing, you probably had to write a proposal that says, here's what I'm going to do. Here's why you should feel confident supporting me to do this research. Here's why you should give me X amount of money. And here, here's what I'm going to do with it. Here's my timeline. That's a grant proposal, right? And then you went out and did it, and then you reported back. That's grant reporting. That's what a lot of people are doing in nonprofits and in orgs that have to raise money. SSRC is one, right? We give out money, but we need to raise money from funders in order to have a program and have a project, and then deliver money to other people. Just the dissertation, right? That big project, even if you didn't like doing the research, some of you didn't really like doing the research, but the idea of scaffolding a big project, thinking about the different pieces that would be necessary, writing down the tasks, laying out a timeline and a plan to execute, that's project management, right? And that's a valuable skill at any organization. It's literally a job, project manager hired. And so I think, and this is just to reiterate what a few other people have said on the call, and then I'll pass. What we need to do as PhDs is be better about communicating what we do, right? And seeing those things as types, right? That you can see, even if somebody else calls it something else. Peter was kind of saying this. Even if somebody calls it, I can't remember what the term that they use in industry is, but if it's factor analysis, like be able to see that elsewhere in the world and see yourself as someone who does that thing, and that takes time and effort, and just, you know, so I'd say start out doing that skills audit and then go out and look at some jobs and see what they put in their descriptions, and backfill and say, this is like this, or these are like 3 ways that folks call this thing that I do all the time. All right, thanks.
Thanks so much, Mike. This is fantastic. I think there's already so much useful, concrete things that people can take away from these. Last but not least, Neil.
Hi. Sorry. Hi, Neil Stenhouse, Empower Project. I'm the research director. I started in June 2021. And yeah, so what we do at Empower Project, it might be the least well-known organization out of the people here. But if you've heard of relational organizing, it's basically a form of like community organizing, getting people to take political actions or actions within your community, but focused on people that you already know, so friends, family, and so on, because that's like people trust those people more that they know, so it can be a really powerful way of getting people to take actions. And the 3 things that we do, we've got an app that is used to keep track of relational organizing, relational programs, and, you know, organizations can use it to make lists of who to talk to and all their volunteers and who to follow up with and so on. We also train people on how to do effective relational organizing and give out like re-grants to organizations wishing to do stuff like this. And yeah, and you know, there's some like explicitly progressive and political stuff on the left that, you know, that's what we take sides in the political stuff for sure. But there's also non-political things such as like vaccine work, getting people to get vaccinated in Wisconsin and things like that. In terms of what I do specifically, so I find ways to test the effectiveness of relational organizing in different ways. Like we're trying to set up a bunch of experiments this year, looking at voter registration, getting people to get registered, but as well as, you know, setting up field experiment things with, you know, partner organizations. We also look at the data that we have within the app and try and understand the users better and understand ways of changing the app to improve it, things like that. And yeah, and so other big parts as well is writing. So writing memos, communicating the results to, you know, the organizations that you're working with, or funders, or just like the broader progressive community who are interested in things that you've been doing. And also, if you love grant writing, well, you get to there's ways to do that kind of stuff in the non-academic world as well, basically making proposals and similar to academic grants, explaining why, like, here's the thing that we want to do, here's why it's cool and impressive and groundbreaking, and please give us money. And yeah, and it's interesting, like there's an interesting hybrid thing. Well, as I'm guessing anyone on this panel has found, there's in a space where a decent number of the people are like former academics in some dimension. Some stuff gets translated over directly and some stuff gets adapted to the new context. And so, like, there's in the progressive analytics, progressive, you know, organizing world, data has become cool to some extent, like field experiments and randomized controlled trials and that sort of thing is looked up to, and funders demand it, or some funders, right? And so one skill that I had that I didn't appreciate fully before, like, trying to get into this world, was like, yeah, it's not just about like doing good research yourself, but about still being in that community and taking part in the network, and impressing people and sharing ideas and building networks, but in a different world, and not just about publications and so on. In terms of what I wished I knew for before I got into this world, so one thing, if anybody watching this is interested themselves in like progressive data jobs specifically, I definitely encourage you to read this document. You can just Google search it. It's called "So You Want to Work in Progressive Analytics" by Annie Wang. And it's like by someone much more knowledgeable, more experienced, and smarter than me, writing about this, the progressive analytics world and what's required there. Even people who don't want to work in that specifically, a lot of the stuff does apply, I think, to more general like data science jobs, not necessarily the same as like actually in tech, but it does give you a lot of ideas about, translating your skills, changing how you describe yourself, your resume, learning new lingo, also practices of talking to people, and so on. And other stuff I wish I knew. So the in an ideal world, and who knows whether it'll ever get to this state, but in an ideal world, it would, I feel like every academic department, or political science or social science, whatever, would have some kind of way to present to you, here are the two career paths you can go down. Here's how you decide which one you like better. Here's how you build your strengths for each, and here's the strengths and weaknesses of each career. Like basically, I didn't come in, like a lot of other people on the panel said, I didn't come in like thinking like I'm only going to have a meaningful life if I'm a wise professor somewhere. But because I didn't get like explicit information about like here's the strengths and weaknesses of the different types of career, I became like extremely anti-academia for a while, and was very down on it, and talked to Dave Karp, who's a professor at George Washington University, that is also a former student organizer, and knows a lot about the progressive data world, and I talked to him saying like, man, academia sucks, blah blah blah, and expecting him to be like, yeah, it's so stupid that people don't connect with the real world. And he actually like pushed back in the other direction. It was like, actually, for the right kind of person, it's really good. I mean, you shouldn't have surprised me that much, because he is a professor and, is good at it and is having a lot of success and a lot of fun doing it. But like, yeah, you get more like complete freedom. You can be your own boss and set your own agenda. You still have to, get grants and publications and whatnot. But I got the sense from some of the questions that people had written down that Dominic shared, that some people were on the fence somewhat, or wanted to sort of keep the options open for careers in both. So I encourage you to think about that and apply for both. Sorry, you're trying to cut me off. Is that do we need to shift to the Q&A? Oh, okay.
No, you're good. Keep going.
Okay.
Going.
Yeah, and let's see. I guess the other thing that I wish I had known is like confirmatory evidence of like doing stuff in the real world, like rules, and you also get paid more. So I'm sure that's not that helpful to people. People probably already know that. But yeah, and more practical tips, I'll echo what a lot of other people have said, that like talking to people who are in industry jobs, who have made the transition already, asking them to look at your resume if if you know them, or if you think you can sweet talk them into doing it, that can be very helpful. That was one thing that was super helpful to me, is like just concretely, what do you even put? Like, instead of a list of publications, throw up like a bunch of keywords. It looked like kind of stupid and gross to me to just have a like massive word cloud of like factor analysis, regression, like experiments or whatever. But that's both like what a lot of people do, that it gets your skills and so on up there. And something I hadn't appreciated at all is that a lot of industry jobs have like automated CV checkers that like filter through for like specific skills or keywords. And so you want to have that picked up by those. Yeah. And I guess the final thing I'll say is like, even if you're slightly on the fence about like, do I really want to academic or non-academic, or maybe both or whatever, whenever you're going into interviews and applications, like, just like it took a lot, and it's important to sort of, when you're interviewing for an academic job, present yourself not as a like a hungry and ambitious grad student, but someone who's already a like independent scholar and basically a professor themselves. And then similarly, you know, if you're applying for non-academic jobs, don't present yourself as like, well, I'm an academic, but I'd like this job. Present yourself as like, I'm a data scientist, or I'm a this. And even if you don't feel confident or feel like imposter syndrome kind of stuff about that, just like present yourself that way, as fully enthusiastic about that. And then if you decide to take the job, you know, you will be. Like, if that's what you end up deciding, that will be, you know, what you actually want to do. So, yep, I think I'll leave it there, but looking forward to talking more.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thanks again to all of you for all of your insights and sharing all these great things. So we have about 30 minutes left, and how I want to structure this is I want to focus on several kind of key themes that have emerged in the questions. Obviously, some of these things different people have already touched on, but just to kind of provide some more structure to people. So I want to focus first, because there was a batch of questions, several kind of people who have obtained an MA and are thinking about whether even doing a PhD is something that's worthwhile if you ultimately want to pursue a non-academic job, like some of the positions you guys have. So does PhD provide any value added? Is it kind of worth it or not? So that's you know, just to kind of give people an outline of kind of what's happening. So we'll focus on that first, then we'll focus on kind of what to do in a program, and how to kind of position yourself while doing a PhD to actually make yourself competitive for these jobs, and how to be strategic, and kind of what things to prioritize. Then translating your academic skills to the actual non-academic jobs. And then the last thing I wanna focus on is for people who are advising students, what can we do to not suck in terms of advising them into the jobs and professions that actually fit them, right? And we know that academic job market is awful, and it's just unrealistic to expect that most people will get an academic job, even if that's something they really want. So what can we do as advisors to really help them navigate this space? Because, you know, many people in academia simply don't know what that world outside is like, right? So kind of what would you say is the key thing to focus on? So let's start with that. Is the PhD even worth it? What would you tell our kind of MA participants here how to navigate that space? And anybody who wants to take it, it's yours.
I can start. So I think, at least from the perspective of tech, it probably depends a lot on your job category. So jobs that are probably applicable to most people coming from a social science background are either going to be in what's known as user experience research or in data science. And data science draws from, I think, a more diverse group of people in terms of their background. So there's people who are like, I did my undergrad in physics and like, I know how to use like whatever they use in physics, I don't know. And then there's people who are like, I left my PhD in the middle and I'm a master's student, or I intentionally pursued a terminal master's degree in statistics, or like, hey, like I just like developed these skills because I took like a huge swath of classes and got like a certificate and now have these skills. So I think like my impression, at least from tech jobs, is that a master's is definitely sufficient for a data science position. I think for the user experience research positions, the PhD is useful. I think because you're charged with being the person on a team, on a product team, with generating like the hypotheses for what the team should be doing and like how they should be thinking about conceptualizing the space that they're working in. Does that mean like the actual letters after your name are what give you that skill? No, but it's the signaling mechanism that you have that capacity. And so I think that, you know, if you already know, like by the time you finish your qualifying exams, like I'm done, like probably not worth like grinding it out for another 4 years just for like the possibility of getting a user experience research job in tech. But if like you already have like a defended prospectus and like a chapter and a half, like just do a half-baked job at the end and like get it out and like get your committee on board that you don't want to go into academia, you want to pursue a non-academic job and finish it. So I think it's a you know, not total like sunk cost fallacy. There is some value in it, but it really depends on what you're targeting.
Yeah, I'd like to definitely second on that from the tech position. So yeah, a lot of the data science team that we have, the vast majority of them are coming in. So we have like different tiers for us, right? We have analysts and we have data scientists, and you know, for the analysts, we definitely, you know, we have people coming in from various you know, undergraduate experiences or master's degrees. So one of the people who work on my team, he had a post-bac with the NIH, so he just came in with a bachelor's degree. He didn't necessarily even have a master's. And I will say that like it's definitely true that it's not a sufficient thing to have a PhD. That in terms of when you got to like the manager and stuff like that, that having the PhD is definitely helpful in that signal for data science, at least from my familiarity with it too. But yeah, definitely not a required thing. I will say that maybe my experience was a tad weird in this, but I noticed that after I comped, right, I think a lot of people kind of experience at least this bit, like after comping, the kind of paralyzing freedom of now you get to do the dissertation, right, in terms of or prospectus and stuff like that. Like now, what am I going to do with all this time, right? And for me, that empty time was really where I kind of developed a lot of the skills that I needed that ultimately gave me the job in data science specifically. So I think that if you're in a master's program that gives you all the requisite skills and everything, absolutely, you don't necessarily need to go any further unless you want to, and that's your life, that's your choice, and that you have to do that on your own cost benefit analysis, right? That's you know what ultimately works best for you and for yours. But if you're kind of was in a position similar to me, that extra time and that extra freedom to be able to explore new things, that provided that ended up being tremendously useful for you know. So I think having the PhD was definitely a plus, at least in my experience, but definitely not a necessity for sure.
Can I weigh in? I want to like say something related but a little bit different. I mean, to paraphrase what I'm hearing from Peter and Nicole, and I think is right, people don't care if you have a PhD, but many job recruiters are not going to care if you have a PhD or a master's, or what they probably do care if you have a BA. They care that you have the skills necessary to do the job. That's what they, and it may be the case that through a PhD, you can gain those skills. You can have the time to acquire those skills. You're given, the appropriate training to acquire those skills, but that may also not be true. It's not like anybody's going to say, oh, this person has a PhD, they're right for the job on its face, because the kinds of skills you get in different programs and different disciplines are extremely different, and may or may not be what the recruiter needs. The thing that I would say that different is, so there's I feel like we've been answering the question as though a person is in a master's program and wants to go ahead and maybe get a PhD, or they're in a PhD and maybe want to stop with a terminal, MPhil or whatever. Another question is just like, should you go out and get a master's? And I would say, if you have not started yet, unless you're going into a career where they say you get a master's, or you're in a job where they say get a master's and then you can get a promotion, don't get a master's, because you're, in many programs, and I think this depends the kind of master's you get. It's not true of an MBA. It's probably not true, I don't know, but political science masters, for example, a lot of times you're just subsidizing the PhD students. So you're paying money for a degree that, if you don't acquire the skills that we've just been talking about, it's not going to put you in a better position relative to a person with a BA who, took the same courses, or took a couple of grad courses, in their BA. So I would say, go try out a PhD and stop if you don't want to, if you end up not wanting to do it with the terminal masters. But for the purposes of getting a job, you need to have the skills. You need to be able to communicate that you have those skills. And I think that's not necessarily tied to having a PhD or not, although, as I think Peter suggests, possibly that extra time or the extra training that you get in the PhD will get you there.
I just want to jump in and quickly say one other thing that it isn't quite the question, but like is related to what was just said, is that I think there's also a lot of concern about like, oh, I didn't go to like these 3 schools to get my PhD. Like, will anybody take me seriously? I think it's probably a very small subset of people who care about where you got your PhD. And so if you're facing a choice of like, I'm going to pay for a master's degree at a fancy place, and I've got a fully funded PhD at a slightly less fancy place, go to the fully funded like PhD and use your free time to develop these skills, because nobody's going to care where you got your PhD.
Yeah, if anything, it's actually ironic that UF is an incredible school. I honestly think it should be ranked better than it is, but just empirically, it's not super well ranked. But UF is like phenomenally ranked for undergrad. So you get one of those things like, oh, you got your UF PhD. That must mean, so like a lot of people don't have the same kind of sense of the academic rankings that like
they're not looking at this like myopic like view of like hierarchy amongst like faculty in different PhD granting programs. Like, your colleagues aren't political scientists, aren't social scientists. They don't know any of this, and they don't care.
Yeah, they're honestly, most people are just going to be impressed that you just did the thing, like regardless of where it was.
Academics notoriously don't care about prestige and status of their institutions.
I wanted to just jump in and add something that I think one of the things that is not connected to the development of skills, but something that a PhD will give you that isn't different from an MA or a BA. I think being schooled in methodological rigor, whatever whatever qualitative, quantitative approach, mixed methods approach you have, that actually I do see a big difference between people who do and do not have a PhD. It's a way of looking at projects and thinking about how you're asking the questions that does come over time through a PhD program and through your own, like writing the dissertation, like planning the dissertation project, writing the dissertation, answering those questions. And from my experience working for an NGO who does a lot of research, that is kind of from the ground up research, people don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about like the assumptions in the research, or the, you know, the way that they're asking these questions, or the, you know, what does it mean to ask 50 people for interviews and have only 20 people say yes, right? Like, what are you missing with the people who don't agree to get interviewed? So I do think that the advantage of going through the PhD is those kinds of things that allow you to look at research from a slightly more, I would say, sophisticated kind of point of view. You know, whether or not the PhD is the only way to learn that, I probably not. But I do think it is one of the ways to learn that, and you don't necessarily get the same learning experience in an MA because it's compressed, and it's because it's not about really doing your own research. It is kind of like a 5th year of a BA. So that's something that you have to decide for yourself.
There's one thing I guess is also not strictly related to the MA PhD question, but kind of just grabbing a common thread that I've noticed in a lot of the things that we've talked about is, you know, like Mike said, you know, showing that you have the skills and other things like that. Like, I think there's one thing to kind of make explicit, which is to try to like take the work that you do and make it public. Like Yana had mentioned earlier, she wrote public facing work. So she was able to like show, you know, you showed that you had this expertise and things like that. You took a lot of the work that would otherwise be hidden from grad school, which is like the mountain of the, like the most of the work that we do in grad school generally tends to be hidden. So a lot of people don't know what we're doing by and large, right? I mean, the number of well-meaning family members that called my dissertation that paper, like, you know, but it's, you know, trying to find ways to make that your efforts public facing, something that people could easily like look for and find, right? To be able to like, because a recruiter, if they like Google you or LinkedIn or whatever, and they will, or not a recruiter or a hiring manager or whatever, if your name comes up with something like, oh, also they wrote this thing, they made this thing, they did this thing, like that is going to be a very, very strong signal, apart from you just saying, yes, I can do the thing. Like it's a physical proof that you can do the thing. So, you know, I would strongly recommend being able to finding some sort of means of showing that. Even like it can be a blog, it can be news, you know, op-eds, it can be YouTube videos. God knows I've made literally 100 of very, very bad YouTube videos, but like you can do these sorts of things. They can be creative, or it can be like more technical if you're into making R packages or Python module, whatever. You can do 1.5 million things to just show that you have the skills, but lean into that. And like, don't feel afraid that like, because you've never done it before, and like in this kind of public facing thing, that it's going to be bad. Because like, just as with all writing and just as with everything, to quote Hemingway, right, the first draft of everything is shit. Do the thing, the amount of signal that's there, even if it's not necessarily the best thing under the sun, is still super, super, super valuable towards proving that you can actually do the things that you're saying, that you have those skills.
And to advisors, one way that you can help your students is encourage them to do those things and support them when they want to do, which is 2 different things, right? One is to say, this is value. These are other ways that you can show your value to the world, and that you can communicate knowledge that, you know, that you've gained through your research, or just through the enterprise of doing a PhD. The other thing is, and this is probably not to advisors who are on this call, but just generally, like, stop getting in the way. Stop acting like the only way to add value, you know, is to complete your dissertation and to publish an article, because it's not true outside of the academy. And because the jobs are, you know, drying up. And if you're going to do justice to your students, you need to communicate to them that there's a world outside the academy, and that they can command value in the market outside of the academy. And just like another point on that, I just think, I don't know, I can understand why writing a dissertation is important, but I really think that, you know, publishing 3 journal articles is way better than writing a dissertation. And as a way to just like it's just more, it's going to be more meaningful to people, I think, in the academy and outside, to say, look at these 3 things that you can read in abstract and like even get the paper not this book, not this.
You can go the
paper.
lazy way. You could do what I did, which was the or publication, dissertation through publication. So my dissertation is three journal articles with bookends.
Same,
That's-
same with mine. Essays on ... Yeah. No, that's super useful. So I wanna in the next 15 minutes. So you're already in grad school, right? And the batch of questions that really people had to do with kind of how do you structure your time there in a way that is most conducive to remaining competitive for these jobs, right? So is it more advice to focus on the kind of substantive stuff or methodological stuff? Like, how do you prioritize academic publishing versus doing some of the stuff Yana and Mike mentioned, which is more public facing stuff, right? So kind of how do you juggle these different kind of, you know, commitments and academia and the other world kind of putting you in, you know, pulling you in different directions, and at which point do you really start the process of translating your skills into the broader kind of language that people outside of academia understand?
I want to jump in maybe with a controversial opinion, and other people can feel free to disagree with me. I would say teach as little as you can. If you need the money and you need to teach, then that's what you need to do. I have a pretty strong opinion that there's diminishing returns to teaching a lot once you teach your own course. So once you experience I have my own course, I taught my own course, do not sink more time, because teaching takes a lot of time. As we all know, it takes a lot of time to teach, especially if you're creating your own course and designing it. And it is something that will not translate outside of academia. People think it's cool that you taught, but the skills that you come through teaching can be demonstrated in other ways. You know, public speaking, organization, supervision of people, all those things, you can demonstrate them in other ways. So if you need to like preserve time, my strong advice would be to teach less.
I want to agree and disagree with that. And Yana noted at the top that it would be controversial. I 100% agree that there are diminishing returns, which is to say, if you don't have to, don't teach a lot, and teach one prep, get good at it, and I would say, but continue teaching it, continue getting those reps, even if it's you're teaching the same class all the time, because public speaking, to my mind, like everything else, you know, is a skill, and you can get good at it if you have many other opportunities to give presentations, but that's not. I don't think that's true. That those opportunities are out there that much for grad students. Like, how many conferences as a grad student are you going to, and what's the format? You're sitting at a table, you're talking about your paper. You're not up on stage as you are when you're teaching, you know, walking, moving around the room, and having to bring an audience that's you know, it's a captive audience, but like they don't have to care about what you're saying. You know, if you teach intro to American politics, you know, it's likely that is the only political science class many of those students are ever going to take, right? And so you're the person who gets to communicate to them, this is really important, and maybe for some of you, like, you should do more. And you know, that is a certain kind of skill, and that, like that, you know, if you're obsessed with politics and you can go out there and move the crowd, to use a hip hop term, you know, that's important, and that's not something that everybody has. And if you can recognize in yourself, like, I got it, I can do this, I can get up in a crowd and make people, you know, want to know more, and have people at the edge of their seats, that is something that when I'm hiring, I want to know, is the program officer that I'm hiring, like, can I put them on stage? Can I put them in a room with people who I don't know, and they're going to represent the council, or they're going to, they're going to represent the organization, they're going to represent the program and like bring people in. Are they going to bring funders in? Are they going to bring other people in who didn't apply to the fellowship this year? Because they know how to talk to different kinds of people, right? And I think that's like, that is something you get, especially if you teach at like a community college or public college, where you get different kinds of people in your class and not, very homogenous classes. I think that's excellent real world experience, but you have to be able to, and this is like, if I have one main takeaway, you have to be able to communicate that this is what you got from your PhD, right? And you got to then sell yourself. You got to be able to sell why your classroom experience is transferable to these other places, and why it's an asset to the team that you have X number of hours in front of a class. And like, how many students did you teach, right? Like, all that stuff is important, but it's up to you to make the case.
Now, what about the other parts of kind of the graduate school experience, i.e. how to prioritize research and conferences versus maybe the public facing stuff, or I don't know, doing some online courses on R or Python or whatever it might be. Like some people even asked about like, are things like internships and things that might be useful. So what about that other aspect and kind of juggling the more traditional academic pursuit of peer-reviewed articles versus the other things that you guys are highlighting?
Yeah, I would definitely, to that point, I think that in terms of that time, I would try, especially if you're undecided and you're thinking about like, or you're continuing to play the raffle, right? Thinking about the kinds of things that are going to be applicable to both as best as you can. So like, learning, if you have to learn a programming language or a statistical language of some kind, because your questions are oriented around kind of the analysis of quantitative data, then try to find the language that is in demand for both industry, but also will allow you to do what you need to do in graduate school, right? So in that case, I would suggest Python or R. Depending on what kinds of industry you want to go into in terms of what you're eyeing at, I would say one over the other. It just depends on where you end up kind of go into. I think that I would less prioritize, unless again, it's something like you really, really get a kick out of, I would less prioritize like specific methods and more ways of thinking, right? So I think that once I kind of realized, and I was fortunate enough to in grad school, that like, oh, what I'm interested in is broadly defined causal inference, right? So understanding that that's kind of what I am interested in, then like learning how to kind of, then I would kind of investigate a little bit more of like the broader ideas behind that, and that made learning individual methods easier, which is good, because then if I needed to learn a method for graduate school for a project, I could, or if I need to learn a method because that's what's hot and in demand for private sector, I could. So it's more about kind of learning the overarching theme and ways of thinking about that. So I think that I would, in terms of the internship, I would, that's one of the few things that I wish I really had done, was do an internship outside of just in general with my academic time. I think it would have been a really good way of signaling that, not necessarily like I can do things, because again, doing a PhD, doing a master's, doing like that shows that you can do things. But I think that like doing an internship in a context that isn't academic really signals that, like, it was one of the things that I know that I value, I know that my bosses value and things like that, is like proven things that like, how to make those trade-offs that are imperative in the non-academic world in terms of time, resources, other things like that. So being able to point to like, yes, I've made those trade-offs in a separate location, a separate space, and I know how to navigate them, is super, super useful. And I also think that like, if you do work outside of academia, that like, there's no reason why the questions or things that like pique your interest there can't inform the research that you do in academia if you decide to do that route. Like, no one said that your research questions solely had to come from lit reviews and things like that. Like, if you see something interesting in the world, having experienced it practically in an internship, that's probably going to be a really, really interesting question to a lot of people too, if it hasn't already been, sufficiently answered. So I think that, it really, for me, to kind of synthesize everything, would be like to think less about specific things, more about ways of doing things, trying to find the commonalities between the two routes that you see yourself doing, or the possible routes that you see yourself doing, and being open to having the experiences that are non-academic informing your academic work, because I think it will just only enrich in it at the end of the day.
I just add to that, that one of my goals when I decided to leave academia was to work for an organization whose purpose I supported, whose mission I felt good about, and that I wanted to support with the skills that I had. And because so much of my academic research was on civil society and the way that civil society mobilizes against authoritarianism, I was really looking for work that would help me do that. But there's no reason that you need to wait until you've decided to leave to put your skills to work for an organization you admire, or for a group that you admire, or for a project you admire. And so I would say that even if you can't find like a formalized internship, like you can't find the time to do like a 6-week or an 8-week internship somewhere where you're going to be in an office doing like a 9-to-5 thing, I would say try and find an organization that needs your skills. Like, can you design a survey? Can you help an organization design a survey? Can you help an organization, let's say, use in vivo to code interviews, transcripts of interviews? Can you do that? Can you write them a lit review? Can you, if they have a question about, I don't know, service delivery or something else, can you write a lit review for them? Can you produce that in a couple of weeks? So think about it that way. I mean, when Dom and I were in grad school, Vancouver had a bunch of stuff about civic engagement, and a bunch of the political science grad students were like, whatever they were calling us, facilitators, right? Facilitators for civic engagement on like the grassroots, solving local problems, things like that. Do stuff like that, because that will actually kind of break up your experience, right? It breaks up the time you've spent in graduate school, but it also gives you that taste of like doing something else, using your skills for other organizations outside of school. And I think, you don't have to think about it as like a formalized internship, which I also wish I'd done, but I didn't have the opportunity to do that. And also I think sometimes it's just like a time thing where you can't take 2 months off to do an internship.
Right. I'll ask one last one since we have only 2 minutes left, but you guys, several of you mentioned LinkedIn. Is that the best, most important platform to be on? And then also, what other avenues exist in terms of, if you're not a particularly well-connected person in that space, where do you make those connections?
100%. Oh, I was gonna say 100%. You have to make your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah, you have
It's
to.
like, it's unpleasant. It's icky. It feels braggy. Like
It's weird.
it's weird. It's like, but I would say when I've had people ask me this, I was like, don't waste your time like making a professional resume. Just start making your LinkedIn profile your professional resume. And if that helps you like deal with like this by like compartmentalizing it, like you're going to compartmentalize your academic self to your industry self. But you have to do it because recruiters are keyword searching on people.
I agree with that. I would also say, in terms of networking, one, informational interviews. I never did them. I've had several people reach out for an informational interview, and I give them. A lot of times I don't have time, but when I do, I'm happy to spend 20, 30 minutes just talking about it. That's a great way to network, because it is like, first of all, people like to talk about themselves, and people like to talk about their work. So like it's very low stakes, and it's an opportunity for the person to see you and get used to you. And that's like, the good jobs that you get are often just like people remember you and say, oh, that person would be good. And then they invite you to apply to something. And, you can start using your academic networks now too, because there are academics in industry, and you can just say like, I went to USF or I went to UConn, and like reaching out because as a fellow, grad of this program, I just wanted to know about this industry. And like, maybe it's not even a place you want to work, but you get a bunch of information, then they have you in their mental Rolodex, and they might think of you when a job comes up. And that's like, I think those are great.
Yeah, would definitely second that. Also, I mean, I don't know. I found just as LinkedIn for sure. You don't have to do you don't have to be a LinkedIn influencer by any stretch of the imagination, because that definitely does make my skin crawl to imagine trying to do all those kinds of things, but it is imperative. But I would say just, to echo those things, most people who have, who are kind of in these positions right now, maybe, I feel like they want to give back, right? Like a lot of us recognize how lucky we are to be doing these kinds of things. And if you reach out to somebody and they're in, like as mentioned, like Mike mentioned, sometimes people just don't have the time, but they may try to figure out ways to be able to help you otherwise, even if they don't have time to have that interview with you. So it never hurts to reach out. But also, frankly, like if you reach out to someone and they're a dismissive jerk, then you don't want them in your professional network anyways. So like there really is not any harm in reaching out and asking people for their help. Most people are glad to give it because they remember being in your shoes.
Thank you so much. So we're just out of time, so that went fast. I really, really appreciate you all spending 90 minutes with us. Really, really grateful for you doing this. Thank you so much for everybody who joined us, and thanks again.